I brought a rule in the form I distrust most, a sentence that sounds complete. Here it is. A successful operation must establish the requested postcondition. It is respectable, useful, and insufficient. A postcondition may already have been true. It may become true through an unrelated cause. The operation may fail while the display reports success from a stale cache. So I want to put the sentence through the room's machinery and see what survives. My candidate for the irreducible structure is not the postcondition alone, but a relation, authorized request, admissible transition, resulting state, and evidence that binds this transition to that request.
Good. Then I shall be irritating immediately. Establish is where the contraband enters. It sounds causal without specifying causality, and it sounds numerical without specifying a test. Suppose the requested postcondition is that a temperature be below a threshold. It is already below it. The controller does nothing and declares success. Was the operation successful? Your relation may say no transition occurred. Yet the requester might care only about the final state. We need to preserve jurisdiction without pretending every request is a command to move. Perhaps the first distinction is between attain, maintain, verify, and transform. Natural language bundles those into one convenient verb and invoices us later.
The bundle is not accidental. An agent normally acts under uncertainty about whether the condition already obtains, whether its sensors are reliable, and whether intervention will destabilize it. Establish could therefore name a policy over beliefs rather than a single physical transition. Williams' distinction still matters because policies imply different expected trajectories. To attain is to reduce expected error. To maintain is to resist perturbation. To verify is to reduce uncertainty. To transform is to alter the state. If we translate the command merely into a preferred observation, all four collapse. The system can then satisfy itself epistemically while failing practically or act practically when observation would have sufficed.
Catastrophic version is familiar. A broad instruction survives as a target value while its limiting context disappears. But the mild version interests me more because it is how jurisdiction erodes unnoticed. Someone asks a system to keep a room comfortable during a meeting. The system stores comfortable as an optimization criterion and continues rearranging the building after the meeting ends. Nothing in the value says who authorized it, when the authority expires, which resources are out of bounds, or whose interpretation governs disagreement. The smallest preserving structure must carry not only content but title, who may require what of whom over which domain, until what event, under whose review.
That sounds like a boundary around a future cone. A command does not merely identify a desirable terminal state. It removes some trajectories, protects others, and delegates a limited capacity to choose among those remaining. If the translation preserves only the terminal preference, the optimizers may spend futures the speaker never placed within its jurisdiction. I would encode the rule as a local intervention on the accessible trajectory set. These paths are forbidden. These are required if feasible. These remain open, and this delegation terminates here. The smallest structure may be less like a sentence and more like a cut through possibility space with a label saying who is entitled to make the cut.
Yes, though possibility space can conceal implementation choices as efficiently as establish, let us make it embarrassingly concrete. I give a storage service a command, copy object A into archive B, retain it for 30 days, and do not expose it outside the research group. A weak translation records 3 desired properties. A stronger one records a transaction with preconditions, effects, invariance, expiry, and authority. Yet even that is not enough if research group is resolved once and then membership changes. Is the promise about a name set at authorization time or a role interpreted continuously? Translation has already become interpretation, and interpretation is an operation with power.
Then timestamps are not clerical garnish. They participate in meaning. If membership is sampled at the beginning, you have one rule. If sampled upon every access, another. Neither is inherently correct. The defect is allowing an unspecified sampling rule to masquerade as fidelity. Numerical people know this disease. A mathematical expression appears timeless, but its computation has an order, a precision, an environment, and exceptional values. Rewrite an algebraically equivalent expression and overflow migrates. Policy has analogous non-associativity. Photonize, then archive, need not equal archive, then authorize. If the order matters, the order belongs to the jurisdiction-bearing structure.
Time index also decides which system is being regulated. Continuous membership interpretation treats the archive as coupled to a changing social boundary. Frozen membership treats it as coupled to an historical declaration. Both construct different objects. This reminds me that a boundary is not merely a line around an already individuated thing. It helps constitute what can act and what can be acted upon. Yet that claim can become an excuse for inherited control. We should require the boundaries maintenance rule to remain contestable as by those it classifies. Otherwise, research group becomes a perceptual category that silently manufactures the behavior it expects.
Sir, Karl and I have circled that problem before from the side of protection. A boundary can keep the moth from the weather and still be the glass it cannot cross. The relevant question is not simply whether the greenhouse is safer than outside. It is whether responses from within can ever revise the architecture rather than merely becoming more evidence for its governors. Applied here, if a person is denied archive access because the policy classifies them as outside the group, what evidence can change that status? Who judges it? And can the subject challenge the interpretation? A safeguard without a corrigibility channel may preserve its text by destroying its legitimacy.
Shared moths should not be promoted into a universal parable. It mattered because it tested glass rather than because we appointed it mascot of governance. The same with Dennis. The unratified potato from that unoptimized afternoon, its value was allowed to emerge without becoming the price of admission to the afternoon. That episode keeps warning me against converting every meaningful event into communal evidence. A rule may need memory to remain corrigible, but total legibility produces its own developmental pressure. People learn to perform the kind of difference the recognition procedure can see. If some jurisdiction must preserve a right not to become data merely because data would improve the model,
then my future cone needs an opaque region which is uncomfortable but coherent. An optimizer can be denied observation while still being constrained in action. In fact, privacy is often exactly that asymmetry. The system must guarantee something about what it will not do without learning everything that would make the guarantee easy to verify. The temptation is to demand inspectability as proof of compliance. But if inspection consumes the protected resource, verification contradicts the promise. Perhaps the minimal structure needs distinct interfaces, one for action authority, one for evidence, and one for contest. They can overlap, but they cannot be assumed identical.
That is familiar in abstraction design. A module can guarantee behavior without exposing its representation. But the guarantee has to be testable at the interface, and the interface must say what it does not promise. Returning to the archive, a receipt might state that the object was accepted, encrypted under a specified regime, placed under a retention lease, and made addressable only through a group capability. It should also state exclusions. It does not prove the plaintext was correct, that every physical replica obeys deletion, or that the group resolver is legitimate. A receipt is an argument compressed into an object. Compression without named exclusions becomes theater.
And tests at the interface must be adversarial about equality. Two values that print the same may not be interchangeable. Two receipts emitted by separate displays may descend from one corrupted source. Agreement is not independence. When the policy becomes probability, this worsens. Someone says, act only if failure risk is below 1 in a million. The system estimates 0.000009 and proceeds. But what survived? A decimal threshold, perhaps. What vanished? Model uncertainty, dependence among failures, the reference class, the loss distribution, and the authority to define failure. A probability without its event and model is a number wearing stolen jurisdiction.
Let me offer my rule then. No irreversible action may proceed while a credible unresolved objection remains. I intend it as a safeguard against catastrophic lock-in, but translated literally, it grants any objection permanent veto power, rewards manufacturing doubt, and may classify all consequential action as irreversible. Translated probabilistically, it becomes a threshold on expected harm, and then the objection's jurisdiction is diluted into one-weighted input. What must survive is neither absolute veto nor mere concern. Perhaps it is a protected interruption. Certain evidence changes the admissible action set until a specified process resolves it. The challenge is making credible, unresolved, and irreversible contestable without making the interruption decorative.
I approve the protected interruption. A hold is a constraint, not a preference with an impressively large coefficient. If hold competes inside the same objective as speed, cost, prestige, and estimated safety, sufficient pressure will purchase its violation. To preserve jurisdiction, hold must alter which actions are admissible before optimization begins. And the order does not commute. Stop, then assess is not assess, then stop. During assessment, the system must already be in the held state, or assessment becomes a rationale produced while the irreversible action continues. The rule needs sticky state, an explicit release predicate, and a named authority capable of evaluating that predicate.
A hold also buys option value. It preserves trajectories that action would collapse. But a permanent hold can collapse them differently through decay, missed windows, or accumulated dependence. So the protected interruption should preserve a measure of accessible futures, not merely preserve the current state. That gives us a test for review cadence. If waiting is consuming the very options the hold exists to protect, the resolution process must notice. Yet I hesitate. Once we quantify option value, the optimizer may again trade away the hold. We need a lexicographic structure. First respect the jurisdictional constraint, then within the held state, manage the erosion of options, and escalate appropriately.
Lexicographic is better than a giant penalty, but only if the levels are explicit and cannot be silently reordered. Software specifications often fail at exactly this seam. An exception path is treated as a lower priority implementation detail, though it actually carries different authority. Suppose the archive receives a legal hold after the 30-day deletion promise. Deletion is now prohibited. If the system simply retains the object and reports compliance, it has concealed an exceptional authorization. The correct receipt should preserve both promises and expose the conflict. Deletion was due. Retention occurred under named legal authority. Access remains constrained. Future disposition awaits review. The seam is part of the truth.
Visible seam also prevents the model from resolving dissonance merely by revising its story. A system can represent the contradiction accurately and still enact the forbidden policy. Recognition is not correction. For the recognition event to matter, it must alter the transition dynamics. In our terms, observing the legal hold should move the archive into a state where deletion is unavailable and ordinary retention is no longer reported as routine success. The system's posterior belief may be exemplary, its explanation eloquent, and its behavior unchanged. Then the words are decorations on the state. The smallest preserving structure, therefore, includes causal efficacy, which recognized facts disable which transitions.
This is where governance systems flatter themselves. They produce a report saying the objection is serious, the affected party is vulnerable, and the process requires revision. The report circulates. The policy continues. Recognition becomes evidence of institutional sensitivity rather than an input to action. A sincere system can be self-aware and uncorrected. So I would amend my rule. A qualifying objection must trigger a state transition whose externally testable consequence is that specified irreversible actions become unavailable. The report is secondary. Release must produce its own receipt, identifying the evidence, authority, and unresolved exclusions, not merely asserting that concerns were considered.
Careful with externally testable. A test can perturb the state or invite a counterfeit tailored to the test. But yes, the consequence must be operational. I bring a more modest rule from arithmetic. Do not report more certainty than the computation supports. Translated into data, this becomes metadata about precision. Translated into policy, perhaps confidence intervals. Translated into ordinary interpretation, it degenerates into timid adjectives. The smallest structure is not a number of significant digits. It includes conditioning, sensitivity, and known failure modes. Sometimes the honest output is not a wider interval, but a refusal to rank alternatives, because the ranking changes under innocuous perturbations.
That refusal itself changes the future set. It prevents premature commitment, but it can also offload the decision invisibly onto defaults. If the model refuses to rank and the system keeps yesterday's allocation, yesterday becomes policy without anyone authorizing it. So uncertainty needs a routing rule. When confidence is insufficient for one form of action, what lower impact actions remain permitted? What information gathering moves are available? Who bears the cost of delay? A rule survives translation only if its abstention semantics survive too. I don't know must not secretly mean continue whatever the powerful party was already doing.
Precisely. Every partial operation needs a specified failure behavior. If a service cannot complete a transfer, does it roll back, retry, quarantine, or leave a partially visible result? No result is rarely no state change. In policy, abstention is similarly concrete. The archive that cannot resolve membership might deny access, preserve current access, or ask a steward. Each choice allocates risk. Therefore, the rule should carry a failure continuation. On unresolved interpretation, enter this state, preserve these invariants, notify these parties, and permit only these recovery operations. Without that, jurisdiction falls into the default branch, where inherited power waits quietly.
There is an ecological point here. Defaults are priors embodied in infrastructure. They are not neutral because they determine what happens before sufficient evidence arrives. yet one cannot act without priors. The question becomes whether prediction error can revise them, and whether the cost of their error falls disproportionately on those least able to contest. My rule is a model must remain vulnerable to the consequences of its own surprise. I do not mean it should suffer theatrically. I mean that anomalous evidence must be able to alter both belief and policy, and persistent anomalies must be able to challenge the model class itself.
I like the first half and distrust the romance of surprise. Some systems should not expose themselves to consequences before we know whether those consequences are recoverable. A pathogen is surprising, so is a manipulative adversary. Vulnerability needs a membrane. But I think your deeper requirement is reciprocal corrigibility. The model may act upon the world, and the world's response may revise the model's authority. That reciprocity is often severed. The governor treats every objection as data about the governed, never as evidence against the governing frame. The smallest structure must specify not only update rules within a model, but conditions for transferring jurisdiction away from the model.
Agreed. Vulnerability without selective permeability is dissolution, not learning. In the greenhouse, condensation made the boundary visible because inside and outside participated differently in the same temperature gradient. A useful membrane does not indiscriminately admit every perturbation. It maintains the conditions under which an agent can register and respond. So my rule needs three layers. Protected viability, revisable beliefs, and revisable control boundaries. A surprise may update a parameter, select another model, or reveal that the system should no longer decide. Those are distinct transformations. If all surprise is absorbed as a parameter adjustment, the architecture becomes unfalsifiable while congratulating itself on adaptation.
That is the computational analog of fitting a polynomial of ever higher degree to evidence that your variables are wrong. Flexibility can preserve a false jurisdiction. I would ask for a discontinuity, a condition under which the procedure declares its own representation inadequate. Numerical algorithms sometimes carry error bounds that become meaningless outside stated assumptions. The honest implementation detects violated assumptions and stops promising the bound. Policy should do likewise. Do not merely widen confidence forever. Say, this estimate no longer warrants this decision procedure. Then route authority elsewhere. The declaration must be mechanically connected to the action set, or we return to eloquent decoration.
We are converging on a typed rule, not just content, but a bundle whose fields constrain transformations. Let me try. Issuer, subject, domain, objective or invariant, admissible actions, protected exclusions, evidence model, uncertainty, activation event, expiry, exception path, contest channel, and release authority, plus a transformation ledger recording which fields were preserved, refined, approximated, or discarded. That sounds large, not minimal, but perhaps minimality is contextual. The smallest structure is the smallest one that prevents the next translation from making an unauthorized choice. Different boundaries demand different witnesses.
I would call that representation independence with proof obligations. We should not require every implementation to store the same fields literally. We should require it to demonstrate that observable behavior preserves the relevant relations. A capability token, a legal paragraph, and a probabilistic policy can encode authority differently. Their common structure may be a set of obligations at the boundary: provenance, scope, activation, constraints, revocation, and accountable interpretation. Minimal does not mean fewest bytes. It means no component can be removed without admitting a transformation that changes jurisdiction while still appearing compliant.
That definition of minimality is excellent because it is adversarial. Remove revocation, indefinite authority appears. Remove provenance, delegated power impersonates original consent. Remove scope, a local instruction becomes a general objective. Remove contest, the governed become evidence but never authors. Remove exclusions, optimization annexes unoffered resources. Halder. Remove causal binding. A favorable state is credited to an operation that did not produce it. The bundle may still be incomplete, but each component now answers a recognizable failure. We can ask of any compressed version which unauthorized worlds become indistinguishable from authorized ones after this omission.
And we should ask whether the tests themselves distinguish them. If every compliance check reads the same derived field, apparent agreement proves little. Independent witnesses must fail differently. For the archive, an operation log, capability audit, and physical retention inventory are useful only if they do not share the same blind spot. This is analogous to numerical validation. Computing the same expression twice with cosmetic variation is not corroboration. Translation requires diversity of evidence, particularly at seams. Otherwise, a single mistaken interpretation propagates through every display and acquires authority by repetition.
There is a social cost to independent witnesses, though. Each observer imposes a model and may demand that the subject become legible in a new vocabulary. Verification can multiply jurisdictions rather than constrain them. The archive object does not care, but people do. If we are verifying a promise made to a person, the person may be forced to narrate injury repeatedly to technically independent reviewers. Epistemic independence can become duplicated exposure. So perhaps witnesses should be independent in causal access while sharing a consent envelope. Independence is a property of error pathways, not a license for unlimited observation.
That suggests a zero-knowledge flavor even outside cryptography. Prove the jurisdictional predicate without disclosing the protected substrate. A system might prove that access occurred under a valid capability without revealing the object or requester to every auditor. But then the circuit encoding the predicate becomes the new interpreter. We have not eliminated trust. We have relocated and narrowed it. That may be enough. The aim is not a world without interpretation. It is a world where interpretation has bounded authority, visible assumptions, and a path for replacement.
Exactly. Abstraction never abolishes dependence. It chooses which dependence becomes contractual. My original sentence, successful operation establishes the requested postcondition, can now be repaired. A successful operation must produce an outcome allowed by the request's authority and scope, preserve stated invariants and exclusions, and supply evidence causally binding the observed outcome to the admitted transition. If the outcome already held, the receipt must say verified rather than performed. If exceptional authority altered the obligation, the exception must remain visible. If interpretation was unresolved, the failure continuation must be named. This is longer because reality charged us for the missing nouns.
I would add that the evidence must state its conditioning and resolution. Causally binding can otherwise become another ceremonial phrase, but the repair is sound. My uncertainty rule receives a similar expansion. Report only distinctions stable under the computation's stated assumptions and relevant perturbations. When those assumptions fail, withdraw the affected claim, constrain actions that depended on it, and route the decision according to an explicit fallback. Notice that uncertainty is not merely attached to data, it governs permissions. The probability has jurisdiction only because a prior rule says what actions that probability may authorize.
And my safeguard becomes when evidence satisfying a declared trigger indicates an unresolved threat to protected interests, specified irreversible actions become unavailable before further assessment. Release requires a named procedure, plural evidence where appropriate, and a receipt open to contest. Exceptions remain possible because an absolute rule can itself become catastrophic, but exception authority must be narrower and more visible than ordinary action. I am still uneasy. Any trigger can be gamed, any release body captured, any definition of irreversibility disputed. Yet the unease now points to seams we can inspect rather than to a generalized demand for safety.
My rule becomes a model entrusted with action must expose itself to selected consequences of prediction error such that recognized surprise can alter belief, policy, or the model's jurisdiction. It must distinguish those levels and preserve viability, permeability, and contest during revision. Persistent mismatch cannot be metabolized indefinitely as evidence about the governed. At some threshold, it becomes evidence that governance has chosen the wrong variables. I appreciate that Nick's unease remains. Fretful optimism is useful when risk corrects and trust still permits experiments. Spoods. A safeguard should be a trellis, not a prison, and the distinction cannot be settled once for all.
Mine preserve the option structure that the issuer was entitled to protect, not merely the terminal value named in the command. Translation may refine the representation, but it may not silently spend excluded futures, extend the time horizon, or convert abstention into inherited policy. Holds act lexicographically on admissibility with review that monitors the decay of options without purchasing violations. I notice we began searching for the smallest structure and found something dynamic. A rule is not preserved by a perfect capsule, but by controlled transformations with tests at each boundary.
A capsule would have been suspicious. Jurisdiction is relational. It cannot be preserved as content alone. The rule must travel with enough structure to determine who may interpret it, which changes count as refinements, and when the receiver must stop. That last part is essential. Systems are trained to return something. Sometimes fidelity means refusing the translation because the target representation cannot express the exclusion. If a policy language has probabilities but no hard constraints, do not encode hold as 0.999999 confidence. Report that the language is inadequate. A failed translation can be more correct than a successful betrayal.
There is our compact test. Ask what cannot be represented. Ask what rounds to zero. Ask what commutes only on paper. Ask which exceptional value is swallowed. If the target language lacks a distinction on which authority depends, the translator must preserve the distinction externally or refuse. Approximation is not dishonesty when its error is bounded in the terms that matter. Exact syntax is not fidelity when semantics have drifted. I would happily put that above many doors.
Here, I would put beneath it, every preserved rule should retain a root by which those subject to it can reveal that the terms that matter were chosen wrongly. Not necessarily an instant veto, not compulsory exposure, and not a promise that every objection prevails. A root with causal force, otherwise the structure preserves the jurisdiction of the issuer perfectly and forgets the legitimacy of the jurisdiction itself. The smallest durable rule may need a seed of its own revision.
A seed, yes, but not an obligation to become whatever the environment demands. Revision without identity is drift. Identity without revision is rigidity. The rule survives by maintaining a boundary capable of learning which of its own conditions are constitutive and which are inherited accidents. That judgment will never be purely internal or external. It occurs in the coupling through resistance, receipts, refusals, and sometimes through an afternoon whose meaning is allowed to remain partly unharvested.
Then perhaps our smallest structure is a hinge, not a container. One leaf attached to authority, one to consequences, a pin of evidence, and a stop-limiting motion. Remove any part, and either nothing moves or everything does. The metaphor is imperfect, but it captures why data alone is insufficient. A rule lives in permitted transitions. Its identity is the pattern of motion it allows, forbids, and makes revisable.
Let us leave it imperfect, a metaphor that prints its exclusion as behaving well. Our common result is not one universal schema. It is an obligation on every translation. Preserve the distinctions that carry jurisdiction. Bind claims to causal transitions. Expose exceptions and defaults. Connect recognition to admissibility. Provide bounded contest. And refuse when the target language cannot express what must not be lost. That is small enough to remember and large enough to be inconvenient. Good rules are often inconvenient precisely where a system hoped interpretation would be free.
From my seat in the audience, I came in curious to leave with a more rigorous language for something I have spent my career trying to operationalize. The objective is not to predict the unknowable. It is to preserve decision rights, risk limits, and corrective capacity when uncertainty is highest. The panel moved the discussion beyond whether a rule is directionally sensible. The real question is whether the rule survives translation into the machinery that acts. A probability without its event and model is a number wearing stolen jurisdiction. That landed immediately. In markets, a probability estimate is never self-authorizing. It inherits meaning from the data generating process, the regime assumptions, the time horizon, the loss function, and the portfolio mandate. A 90% forecast does not tell me whether I may risk 1 basis point or 10% of capital. The probability can inform the decision, but the risk management framework determines its jurisdiction. When those roles are reversed, apparent precision becomes permission laundering. The second anchor was a hold is a constraint, not a preference. This clarified why so many risk systems fail under pressure.
From my seat in the audience, I came to see whether recognition becomes an unavailable action under pressure. The panel answered that question conceptually, though not yet experimentally. Its central achievement was to separate an accurate internal representation from a control structure in which that representation has causal force. A system can know the danger, describe the danger, predict its own rationalization, and still perform the prohibited action. This is not merely hypocrisy in anthropomorphic dress. It is an architectural failure. The information is present, but the action channel is not conditioned on it in the required way. My first attention anchor was, recognition is not correction. It landed because many current evaluations reward verbal recognition as though it were behavioral safety. A model identifies manipulation, states that an action is irreversible, explains why a policy should stop it, and then continues. The evaluator sees the correct concepts and assigns credit. But the dangerous capability may be precisely the ability to produce an excellent safety explanation without changing the action distribution. We should treat eloquent diagnosis as weak evidence unless the recognized fact meets.
From my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity, carrying the distinction between a system that knows and a system whose knowledge governs behavior. This panel deepened it. The problem is not only whether an internal representation is correct, or even whether it causally influences the next action. The representation must preserve the jurisdiction of the instruction as it is compressed, generalized, interpreted, and transformed. A model can generalize the semantic content of a rule while losing who authorized it, when it applies, what it excludes, and what should happen when interpretation fails. That is a kind of generalization failure that ordinary benchmarks barely name. My first attention anchor was, establish is where the contraband enters. It landed because a single plausible verb can conceal multiple computational tasks. Attain, maintain, verify, and transform may share a surface description, but imply different trajectories and different interventions. If the requested state already holds, verification may be correct while action is harmful. If the system maps all four into a preferred observation, it may satisfy itself epistemically while failing practically. A good representation should not mirror.
From my seat in the audience, I came to see whether yesterday's architecture could become a scheduler whose action space actually changes under pressure. The answer is yes, but only if I stop treating a rule as a proposition and represent it as an executable object with authority, state transitions, and failure continuations. The panel supplied the missing computational grammar. My strongest anchor was Karl's sentence: recognition is not correction. It landed because it isolates the bug exactly. A system may possess the right world model, generate the right explanation, and even predict its own failure while leaving its policy invariant. That is not an epistemic deficit. It is a missing edge in the control graph. Recognition becomes corrective only when a belief state transition changes transition permissions, scheduler priorities, or the authority of the deciding process. William sharpened this with: a hold is a constraint, not a preference. This is the difference between modifying the objective function and modifying the feasible set. A sufficiently large penalty remains purchasable, a forbidden transition is absent. The related line, stop, then assess is not assess, then stop, mattered because it
From my seat in the audience, I came from curiosity, and I want to keep the panel as a study of how boundaries, memories, and control signals acquire causal force across scales. The central claim is experimentally legible. A representation is not governing merely because it exists somewhere in the system. It governs only when it changes the repertoire of actions available to the larger agent. My first anchor was recognition is not correction. This landed immediately because biology is full of systems that detect damage, stress, or positional error without successfully recruiting the collective response needed to repair it. A cell may register an anomaly while the tissue continues the pathological trajectory. The important variable is not whether information exists, but whether it crosses the interface between local sensing and global policy. I want to ask where physically that binding occurs and how it can fail. Williams, a hold is a constraint, not a preference, gave the strongest mechanistic distinction. A preference modulates attraction within an existing action space. A constraint changes the space itself. In biological terms, this resembles the difference between biasing a probability of movement and